Informed consent is the most vital aspect of any research study. Ethical issues in past studies have impacted the process of informed consent, resulting in the guidelines and regulation requirements to conduct research. In this module, we'll be discussing ethical and regulatory impact on informed consent. The objects of this module are first to define informed consent. We will review historical research studies related to the ethics of informed consent and the concerns for ethics in future research. We will do a brief review of ICH GCP guidelines and the FDA regulations related to informed consent. We will then apply our knowledge to a case scenario. This module will conclude with a knowledge check. Informed consent is defined as a written or verbal agreement of a participant to be in a study and must be obtained prior to conducting any research activity. Permission should be given after a clear explanation of the study's risk and benefits have been provided to the participant. The researcher should only accept the participant's agreement after they've been able to ask questions and have expressed their understanding of the expectations during the trial. If they choose, they should be given the opportunity to discuss the research study with family or friends who are part of their support system. Informed consent must be voluntarily given by the subject without coercion or undue influence. The participant must be apprised that the consent may be withdrawn at any time during the study. Informed consent does not end with a signature on the initial form, but it is an ongoing dialogue required throughout the study. As research professionals, we should be aware of the historical events that led to the guidelines and regulations for informed consent. Some of the clinical trials that have been associated with the unethical consent of participants began years before the principles were part of research practice. The Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 1946 were held after World War II to prosecute the inhumane human experiments which were conducted by the Nazi doctors on concentration camp prisoners. Informed consent was never obtained, and the risk far outweighed any benefits, and often caused death, severe pain, and lifelong disabilities. The prisoners were primarily Jewish. The study of untreated syphilis, often named as the Tuskegee syphilis study, occurred amongst rural black men in America. These African American men living in Tuskegee, Alabama, were enrolled in a trial that aimed to study the natural history of syphilis. They were led to believe that the serial lumbar punctures done to examine cerebral spinal fluid were actual treatments for syphilis. They were coerced to participate through this misinformation and with promised deferrals from military service. Even after penicillin was discovered as a treatment, this option was withheld from them. Despite the publication of the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, the study continued until 1972. During the Clinton administration, victims of this study were issued a formal apology and reparations. Henrietta Lacks's story began in 1951, when she initially was diagnosed with a severe, rapid-growing cervical cancer. As part of her operation, cells were retained and became used in a wide variety of preclinical studies. The cells were named according to the first two letters of Mrs. Lack's first and last name, H-E-L-A or HeLa, what we today would consider to be a private health information HIPAA violation. Further, she was not told that her cells were being used in research or in future research, which is now an aspect of current informed consent practices. Notably, there were many scientific advances because of the experiments on HeLa cells. Polio eradication, improved cell culture practices, chromosome counting, genome mapping, human papillomavirus vaccines, the study of leukemia, and HIV. Because of her aggressive cancer, Mrs. Lacks died at the age of 31 without ever consenting to be in research. Henrietta Lacks was an African American woman. In the Willowbrook experiments, children with developmental disabilities were studied without their consent. Researchers told the parents that serum hepatitis was inevitable in crowded institutions housing disabled children. So the parents consented to the children being injected with hepatitis so they could study the disease and new treatments. The parents never received a full explanation of the studies being conducted or the effects of hepatitis B. Being enrolled in the study was a condition of being given space within the facility. The parents were coerced into signing the consent with the promise of better living conditions and medical treatment for their disabled child. In more current history, the Havasupai Indian tribe consented to a clinical trial, but the researchers stored and used their blood. The Indian tribe believed that the research was about the high rate of diabetes, but never notified of the other research studies using their samples, including mental illness and identification of the tribe's origin. This caused an uproar from tribal leaders and families because it contradicted their fundamental tribal beliefs, and blood was held sacred in their culture. Each of these circumstances had informed consent violations. Moreover, each of the populations involved were vulnerable populations with health equity and racist undertones. As medical advances are occurring at a rapid pace, informed consent becomes increasingly challenged. With genetic testing, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, new frontiers are dealt with by the bioethicists to help improve informed consent practices. However, violations remain problematic. Historical events surrounding informed consent violations have led to international guidelines such as the Nuremberg Code, the Belmont Report, the Declaration of Helsinki, and the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. Let's review these. The Nuremberg Code was the first human subject protection document to evolve in modern times. This document was a result of the Nuremberg trials of the Nazi doctors discussed in earlier slides. This code reiterates the values presented by Hippocrates in the Hippocratic Oath, but the code applies it more succinctly in this modern era of experimental research involving human beings. The bullet outline formulates the values established as new standards for research in 1947. The values listed are voluntary consent and that animal studies should precede human experiments. Patients should be considered free to refuse participation or to discontinue a study at any time. Unnecessary physical or mental harm should be avoided. The risk should not exceed the benefits, and the studies themselves should be of value. They should yield fruitful results for mankind. A website is included for additional study of the Nuremberg Code. The Declaration of Helsinki, originally generated by the World Medical Association in 1964, expands on the values set forth by the Nuremberg Code. It reiterates that the risks should not outweigh the benefits. It emphasizes that studies should be scientifically valid and valuable to the population under study. It focuses on the informed consent process and the ethical duty of the researchers to protect life, privacy, and dignity. Moreover, it requires that researchers should be trained and qualified, and that the data be accurate and valid. The Declaration of Helsinki has come under some debate and discussion among bioethicists, especially surrounding its revision and issues related to placebo controls. It remains an important document within Good Clinical Practice Guidelines, GCPs. The last version of the Declaration of Helsinki occurred in 2013, including guidelines for identifiable human material or data post-trial provisions, research registration, and dissemination of results. The Belmont Report was developed in 1979 by a commission of scientists who met to discuss the ethical issues in clinical research as a result of the National Research Act of 1974. The report discusses behavioral and medical research and describes the differences between practice and research. It has 3 main points. Autonomy, defined as the general respect for persons and the acknowledgement that the individual has the right to make up their own mind whether or not to participate or continue in a study. This is called self-determination. Beneficence, described as the obligation to do no harm, which is a reference back to the Hippocratic Oath. Moreover, it requires that the benefits must outweigh the risk for a study to be considered ethical. Justice is the principle that all people are considered equal and that there should be equality in subject selection for bioethical and statistical reasons. This document was published in the Federal Register and made available to researchers, institutional review boards, and ethical review committees worldwide. The Belmont Report is provided in this module as a handout. All persons involved in the conduct of clinical research should be familiar with this document as well as the Declaration of Helsinki before commencing their work with human subjects. In addition to bioethical guidelines for informed consent, there are federal laws. Each country has its own regulatory authority for food and drugs, and in the United States, it is the Food and Drug Administration. The Code of Federal Regulations are the codification of the general and permanent rules and laws published in the Federal Register by the departments and agencies of the Government Publishing Office and the Federal Register, or OFR. These statutes have been ratified into law by the United States Congress. Title 21 is the set of laws related to food and drugs. Title 45 is the set of laws related to public welfare. The key documents that relate to informed consent, including the responsibilities for informed consents by investigators, sponsors, and institutional review boards or ethics committees, are found in Title 21, Part 50, 56, and 312, and in Title 45, Part 46, which is known as the Common Rule. Title 21 CFR Part 50 addresses informed consent and has many of the same aspects as the ICH-GCP guidelines. The Code of Federal Regulation is the law that protects participants of human experimentation. Title 21 CFR Part 50.20 lists the requirements for informed consent in detail. As a research professional, we should be cognizant of each aspect of this requirement and incorporate them into our approach to a potential participant. The basic element of informed consent can be found in 21 CFR 50.25 and serve to guide informed consent templates and practices. Title 21 CFR 56.111 deals with the criteria for IRB approval of research. The IRB approves the study protocol as well as the recruitment plan, the informed consent form, and any educational materials used as part of the informed consent process. As of note, anything that the participant may see or read regarding the study must be approved by the IRB to ensure no coercive language has been used. Part 56.111 states in Section 4, informed consent will be sought from each prospective subject or the subject's legal authorized representative in accordance with and to the extent required by Part 50. Section 5. Informed consent will be appropriately documented in accordance with and to the extent required by Part 50.27. Section 6. Where appropriate, The research plan makes adequate provisions for monitoring the data collection to ensure the safety of the subjects. In Part 7, where appropriate, there are adequate provisions to protect the privacy of the subjects and to maintain the confidentiality of the data. Title 21 CFR Part 312 has additional language supporting 21 CFR Part 50, including the responsibilities of sponsors in choosing investigators, training them, and inspecting investigators' records and reports. It further describes investigators' responsibilities, including informed consent. Exceptions to informed consent, such as emergency use, is covered in 21 CFR 312.60, and those circumstances when the FDA may disqualify an investigator and sometimes prosecute for informed consent and protocol violations. The Common Rule was established in 1991 regarding biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects, and it was revised significantly in 2018. This is the baseline standard of ethics for human subject research for any federally funded research. It is also called consent law for the federally funded research. Sections describe general requirements, documentation of informed consent, and special vulnerable populations. The subpart sections of 45 CFR 46 include Subpart B that protects pregnant women, human fetuses, and neonates. Subpart C addresses the ethical concerns with prisoners. And Subpart D addresses research in children, which will be covered in Module 1.3. The International Council for Harmonization, or ICH, formerly the International Conference on Harmonization, held an inaugural assembly meeting on the 23rd of October in 2015, establishing ICH as a legal entity under Swiss law as an international association. This began through discussions between Europe, Japan, and the United States to harmonize guidelines for clinical research. The ICH was started in 1990 with the emphasis on safety, quality, and efficacy topics, and now includes interdisciplinary topics such as the Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities, or MEDRA, and the Common Technical Document, CTD. The ICH GCP guidelines are found in the Efficacy Guidelines section, named ICH E6R2, which are based on the Declaration of Helsinki and are accepted worldwide. These are more granular and practical than the U.S. federal regulations. The FDA has adopted the ICH GCP as guidelines for research in the United States. Section 4.8 of these guidelines addresses informed consent. The highlights of these guidelines are: written consent should be provided to the subject or participant. No coercion or undue influence should be placed on the participant to consent. No language should be used that would have the participant waive their rights. The participant should be fully informed of all pertinent aspects of the study. The language used in the consent should be understandable, not technical, and be in the same language that the participant speaks. The participant should have sufficient time to read the consent after provided with the explanation and be able to ask questions. Informed consent should be signed and dated by the subject, and a copy of the signed consent provided to the participant. If a participant is unable to read or understand what they are consenting to, a legal authorized representative must be available to sign. If the study is being conducted in an emergent situation, the legal authorized representative, or LAR, may sign the consent, or the IRB must approve for the participant to be enrolled in the study. Most importantly, all informed consents must be approved by the IRB before use. So let's apply what we know using a fictitious scenario for us to work through together. Missy is a 32-year-old in the breast clinic where she just learned that she has recurrent breast cancer. Her best friend came with her since her husband is home watching their 4-year-old son who has a fever. The CRC approaches her about a new drug trial that the clinic is conducting. She meets all the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the study. She's visibly upset, but seems interested in the study. Let's unpack several of the issues for this case study from the perspective of the potential research participant, Missy. Let's unpack the issues here given what we know about this clinic patient. What might she be thinking and feeling?
My cancer is back. Cancer scares me. My aunt and my grandmother on my mom's side had breast cancer, and they died. I'm going to die. It came back. There is no hope. Oh, no. Who's going to take care of my little boy? I don't want to die. He needs me. I feel a roar in my ears. This lady's saying something to me, but I can't hear her. Who is she? What does this mean for me? Will I lose my hair again? I'm about to have a full-blown panic attack. I've got to get home to my husband. I know he's going to freak out. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do? How can I work taking this treatment? I can't take off work. We need my salary for our new house that we just got last month. And my father just had a stroke, so my mom can't even help me with the baby. My husband and my friends, they all work too. Who's going to help me? How am I going to afford treatment? My insurance is bad, especially since I had cancer before. I need to talk to my husband. I need time to process this. What consent? What study? What does it entail? I can't think about that right now. Wait a minute. Maybe I should just sign it, because it might cure me. Maybe my cancer won't come back if I do this. What are the risks? Will I get chemo brain? Last time my kidneys didn't do well. Will that happen again? Or maybe worse? What about the genetic test they did on my tumor? Can I pass this on to my son? Doesn't this run in families? What will happen to my genetic records? I have no idea what this consent is saying. I am so confused.
Ideally, the study coordinator recognizes the key issues impacting this patient in this set of circumstances and the participant's ability to provide informed consent. So the coordinator's response may be, "Wait a minute, I can see that you are overwhelmed. Let's take a step back. We are on this journey with you, but you have a lot to digest. I am sorry I came in and you're feeling shocked and rushed. Here's what I'd like to propose. I'm going to give you this form, but I want to talk you through it step by step, but not today. You are too upset and need time to process. Yes, this is research, but you can take your time to think it over. Go home, talk to your husband, and whoever else helps you with big decisions, like your family. I'm going to call you to set up a time to chat over Zoom so that I can tell you more about the study. But in the meantime, I'm giving you my card with my information on it so that you can call if you have questions. You will receive the same standard of care that you had with your first breast cancer, and research does not interfere with that. What can I do for you in this very moment? I'm glad you have a friend to drive you home." So often, the goal of the participant recruitment numbers makes it a challenge for the CRCs to stop and consider the process messages of the participants based on their diagnosis, age, socioeconomical status, gender, home responsibilities, work responsibilities, education, and physical condition. To obtain a true informed consent, the clinical research professional must understand the barriers that may impact the patient's voluntary agreement. The key points to remember regarding informed consent are: 1. Ethical issues can influence informed consent, as evidenced by the historical cases that we discussed. As clinical research professionals, we must prevent unethical practices related to informed consent. Also, research professionals must be aware as we move into new ages of clinical research that there are future concerns related to research that will affect the informed consent process. The informed consent should reflect what the intentions of the research are and how the information on specimens will be utilized. ICH-GCP and the FDA regulations have very specific guidelines for obtaining informed consent. To read the ICH-GCP guidelines and the Code of Federal Regulations regarding informed consent, you are encouraged to access these documents provided to you in the learning activity of this module. Informed consent is the key aspect of clinical research. Thank you for watching this module on the ethics and regulatory impact on informed consent. Please complete the knowledge check in this module.